Welcome to the 2020 Buckeye Book Fair. Thank you for joining us for this series of virtual events with Ohio authors and illustrators. The Buckeye Book Fair provides an annual celebration of literacy through author visits, educational programs for K through 12 students, and events for people of all ages. All of the books featured today and throughout the entire Buckeye Book Fair are available for purchase at buckeyebookfair.org. Should you have any questions for the presenters, please click on the Q&A button and type them in the window that appears, and they'll be answered later in the session. Cinda Chima has worked for the Akron Beacon Journal and as a freelance journalist with the Cleveland Plain Dealer, turning to full-time writing in 2009. Her latest novel, Deathcaster, is the indispensable conclusion to the New York Times best-selling Shattered Realms series, in which this master storyteller delivers spellbinding action, bittersweet reunions, and dazzling revelations. Emily A. Duncan was born and raised in Ohio and works as a youth services librarian. Her book, Wicked Saints, is a thrilling start to her Something Dark and Holy trilogy of Gothic fantasy novels. In it, a girl who can speak to gods, a prince in danger, and a boy with a monstrous secret must work together to assassinate a king and stop a war. After working in public and community health for some years, Intisar Khanani decided to focus on her passion for writing and become an author. The book Thorn tells the tale of a 15-year-old princess, Alira, who always longed to escape the confines of her royal life, yet believes she has little hope for a better future. But when a mysterious sorceress robs her of her identity, she hopes to make a new life as a simple Goose Girl. However, she soon learns that fate has something more in store for her. And here is our moderator for this session, Cinda Chima.
Hello. I can't tell you how excited I am to be moderating this panel and hanging out with these two stellar fantasists. For those of you who may be looking for Mindy Arnett, unfortunately, she couldn't join us this afternoon, so we're going to have to make do with a trio. I've really enjoyed Intisar and Emily getting to know your books a little better. If you were to see my to read shelf, you would know that I'm always behind. Excuse me. So I'd like to, make this as informal as it can be, given the limitations of the format. So if I ask a question to one or the other of you and the other one has something to add or contribute, or you want to heckle the other panelist, that's okay with me. So I'm going to start with a question for Intisar. I know that fairy tale retellings have been phenomenally successful. And one thing I like about it is that it continues the tradition that each storyteller modifies the story to fit his or her own experiences and the characters that she wants to put on the page. So what was it about, I know that your book Thorn is based on the Goose Girl, which is a classic fairy tale. What was it about that story that spoke to you and made you want to explore it in your own way?
So the Goose Girl is a really, really strange story. It's about a girl who is a princess, and her mother, the queen, sends her off to marry an unknown prince in unknown land. She's the only child of this queen, so they immediately are wondering, why are you sending your only heir off to marry an unknown agent? But she's betrayed along the way by her lady in waiting or her maid, depending on the version that you read, and she's happily goes off to be a goose girl for months, and you wonder, even in the original, why. There's so many questions here. Why She has a talking horse who never tells anyone what happened to her. She can control the wind, but she never uses it to defend herself. There's a lot of questions in the story, so it was really fun to be able to go back to it and ask those whys and come up with my own answer. And for me, it was really a story about empowerment and finding your own place in the world and learning to stand strong in yourself. And so finding the answers to those questions in a way that carried that out and allowed me to explore different themes was really fun. But this was also my very first book that I ever drafted. And so it was also a writing exercise I did for myself. I never intended to publish it when I first wrote it. It was my senior year of university. And I was like, well, if I always wanted to be a writer, I should write a novel right now. I'm not really sure
what I was thinking when I was in university.
I was like, well, I had a 20-hour week job. I had an overload of credit hours because I had transferred. I was, running different clubs, and I decided I absolutely had to write my first novel that year. And so I thought, this will tell you what a naive writer I was, that it would be much easier if I picked a tried and true plot and just wrote a retelling.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no.
I take that was not a correct assumption.
No.
And so aspiring writers, sometimes it does happen. You've probably been told, well, you have to write 10 novels and put them in the drawer before you successfully publish one, but there are exceptions to that rule, although I'm going to talk a little bit about your long and winding road to publication.
And I will say that I wrote 8 or 9 other manuscripts between writing Thorn and publishing it. And I came back and revised Thorn multiple times. So it's not like I wrote it and I put it on a shelf and then 10 or 12 years later I published it. There was a lot of work to read it. When I sat down to read it after I had written it, I literally almost fell asleep. And I am used to reading boring stuff. I was a business major. Like, I read accounting books. This was work. So but the thing, I think, if there's any aspiring writers out there, the thing to realize is that the difference between your writing and the books you love is that those authors persisted. They wrote that terrible first draft and they kept trying. And that's what you have to do too, because you can look at your own writing and see that it is not the same as the published works you love. And that's good perspective, but it doesn't mean you should give up. It means you have a knowledge of what it takes to make a good story, and now you've got to work on it.
That sounds like really good advice. Emily, speaking of fairy tale retellings, Roshana Chokshi has described Wicked Saints as a snow-frosted, blood-drenched fairy tale. And you seemed like such a nice girl. The mother of one of my colleagues at the university read one of my books, started reading one of my books. It started with a massacre. And that's what she said. You seem like a nice girl. So it does seem, I even looked up Gothic fantasy because it's described that way so much. And it is defined as something that combines horror, death, and at times romance. So what is it that speaks to you about the dark side?
It's fun. I have a lot of fun.
Yeah, fun is good.
I like not necessarily pushing boundaries. That's not quite like the phrasing I would want to use, but I like writing things that get really weird. And so, like, for example, like Wicked Saints, when I wrote it, it was a little more I had spent a really long time writing a different book. I spent 11 years writing a different book that was also dark fantasy. And when I tried to query it, like it was bad. It ended very badly. It was not a good book, but that was that. So I wrote Wicked Saints. I was like, I'm just going to write this. I'm going to have fun. I'm just going to write this and have fun. I'm not going to think about like what happens when I finish it. And if I'm going to do anything with it, I'm just going to do the things that I have fun doing, which is weird, bloody magic and characters who are arguing all the time and maybe are friends, but also I think they might hate each other a little, and big world building full of monsters, and we'll just have a good time. At the end of the day, I just want to have fun.
And really, so I often tell aspiring writers, don't go into writing because you want to be a millionaire. If you don't enjoy the process, find something else to do.
It's not fun, don't do it.
Likelihood of finding your fortune that way. So,
right.
And conflict is good, right? And yeah,
it is. Yeah. But yeah, so I wrote A Wicked Saints is, I think it's funny that it gets described as being a fairy tale. I've always considered it as like, you know, your general just high fantasy questing kind of book. But when I wrote Ruthless Gods, I had kind of realized what I'd done at the end of Wicked Saints kind of changed the genre a little and was kind of nudging it more towards horror than Wicked Saints was. Mm-hmm. And so I did not grow up reading horror. I didn't grow up watching horror movies. So I had to like really fast get an education in both. Mm-hmm. And watched a lot of horror movies all at once. Mm-hmm. And so I discovered that it's a lot of fun. It's incredibly cathartic. There's something about writing horror that is really difficult. I think horror and comedy are the hardest things to write. But it's also, I just have so much fun with it.
I saw a reference to Slavic folk tales in your role as a youth librarian, enabling you to, was there, and I noticed in your book, an influence of Middle European or Eastern European. Is that the case, or?
Yeah, I worked at Kent State when I was writing it. I was a graduate student and reference assistant, and so I had, you know, the entire university interlibrary loan system at my hands. And the book was originally inspired by Russian folklore, because I just really love it a lot. And as I was trying to write it, I was finding that I had this other country and I hadn't really figured out like what the other country looked like. And so I couldn't get anywhere. And I had I didn't even end up reading it, but it was a book about some random war between Russia and Poland in like the 20s, just a tiny little skirmish. And I was like, okay, there might be something there though, because these two countries do not like each other. And so I ended up doing a lot of digging for Polish folklore, which is way more difficult to find because so much of it isn't translated. And so much of what is translated on the internet isn't necessarily correct, which is something I discovered very quickly. And so it became a challenge, and I love doing research and I love challenges. So it was a lot of fun, because Russian folklore was a little easier to research, little more breadth in what gets translated, but Polish folklore I had to do like a lot of digging.
You know, and a lot of people think that we write fantasy so we don't have to do any research, right? You just make stuff up, right? And
it's all made up. Everything in my book is fake.
And I often say, you know, you have to get the details right or you will lose the reader. If you have horses in your book, even if they're talking horses, You have
I
to
hate
get
riding horses.
details right about how far they can go and what the tack is like and how a horse is likely to behave, or all the horse people will be like, they'll leave you immediately. Now, is there anything that you wanted to, go ahead.
I've actually had to have horse sensitivity readers, basically. The horses read my books and tell me.
Well, I call that my sister who has horses. Yeah. I mean, you have to nail, if you're expecting the reader to believe all of this fantastic content that you're putting in your story, you have to have the details that tie it back to real life.
Actually, one of the greatest compliments I received on Thorn was a girl who grew up in a stables writing to me to ask if I was a horse person because I had written the horses perfectly. And I was like, oh
yes. I forgot about the horses in my book.
5 times in my life.
Did you ask her to write a review on,
Right.
could you please
knowledge
testimonial? Yeah. Back to Intisar. One of the things I've always liked about fantasy is that it enables you to address a lot of the issues in the real world without people throwing up the barricades and getting doors shut. And even sometimes you can address it without gatekeepers getting between your work and readers. And I know that your character in Thorn has a history of abuse. Could you talk a little bit about why you incorporated that? I know as part of your character, and if you were trying to accomplish something in particular.
So I agree with, I'll start with, I love speculative fiction generally because you create a framework outside of your reader's world and knowledge. And when you invite them in, and this is especially true for young adults, but even for adults, you can question authority, you can question social norms, you can question the way we understand reality. And they will come along for the ride because it's all make-believe as far as they're concerned. And so they're open to, readers become open to asking questions and delving with issues that if it was set in a contemporary setting, they would have their own baggage already there with them and they wouldn't be willing to look at certain things. So I really do love that about, especially fantasy. Is that you like you said, you can bring these issues forward. So Alira and Thorn comes from a history of abuse. I mentioned earlier how the Goose Girl has these really weird plot hole questions about it, and one of those was why would a princess walk away from privilege and rank in order to become a manual laborer? And there has to be a really good reason, and the reason I kind of came down to was that her privilege and rank had never actually been a protection to her, that she, as we know, domestic violence and abuse crosses all borders. It's not bound by class or socioeconomic status or religion or anything. It happens everywhere. And so that gave me and gave Alira a very good reason to be like, you know what, princess is not everything. Like it has never been a safe space for her, and she walks away from it. But part of why I also really wanted to write it is when I was, the years that I was working on Thorn, I noticed a trend in both YA and adult fiction, and it's still there to a certain extent, where someone has this tragic past of a trauma or abuse or assault, and they're struggling with it, and one day they're like, I'm gonna be over it. I'm not gonna let me rule it. It's not gonna rule me anymore. I'm a new person today. And they are healed. And it's like this magical moment. And it is so disturbing to me because that's not what trauma's like. You can absolutely say that. But when you go to bed that night, trauma will be waiting for you. Your abuse is still there and it will sink its claws back into you. it is not a momentary decision. You fight years to get over it. And this kind of fairy tale that we tell ourselves about how you can heal is harmful to people who have survived abuse and trauma, because they wonder what's wrong with them, that they can't fix themselves like everyone else they read about and that they see in the movies. And it's harmful to everyone around them, because people are like, well, why don't they just get over it? I mean, it's been 3 weeks or it's been 3 years and they should be over it by now. And that is, you don't get over it, you get through it. And it takes time. And so much of this story is Alira learning to get through her abuse and learning to understand that she can trust again, that it's hard work. There is no insta love here, even though we've got princes and princesses, because she is not able to do that because of her past. She cannot trust anyone that quickly and that easily and that deeply. And I think that that's a story that we all need to hear. So I didn't write it as like, I'm going to teach people about abuse.
Oh, no.
but
I mean, any story that's like a lesson. I mean, I think readers, for good reason, run the other way. You know, I'll have people come up and say, well, I think you should write a novel that will teach teens to respect their parents, you know. And I'm like, how do they react when you start lecturing them? You know, why would they buy a book by me doing the same thing? No, theme arises out of story. It doesn't arise. Story doesn't come from theme.
And really all we can do then is do justice to the theme. And so that's what I was trying to do.
Yeah. So, Emily, I know that, of course, Wicked Saints is out, and you had the misfortune of publishing the second book in the series in the middle of a pandemic. You know,
right at the start.
That I have sent up right now, it's like, thank God I'm not still teaching. Thank God I don't have my book releasing. I'm sure it was better being the second book in a series, because at least it was on people's radar screens. But what have you found are some of the challenges of writing a fantasy trilogy?
The pandemic didn't help.
Oh,
it was because it was April, so like everyone was still in kind of lockdown. Like I wasn't working at that point, and it made it feel like the book just never came out. Like I had a really overwhelming release day because like my Twitter notifications never stopped, but then like immediately after that it was like, okay, but is anyone gonna read it though? Like are we gonna read it? And it still kind of feels that way because time this year has moved so funny. It feels like, you know, we're like 5 months away from the third book being out, but it doesn't feel like the second one has been out long enough for anyone to even read it.
Yeah.
But some like challenges that I found, I don't plot or plan. I don't plan at all.
Really?
And so not even a little bit. So I remember I did a book event for a friend's book release last summer, and I was drafting book 3, and I admitted to them like I don't know how this is gonna end. Like I'm halfway through this draft, and I guess we'll find out when we get there because I don't know. And that's hard it's hard to close a series when you haven't been planning.
Like I have to go back. You know, you think, oh dang it! If I'd known this was going to happen, I would have set it up better
differently.
Yeah, and so sticky notes in all the books, the previous
or.
book.
You set up something in book 1 and then you realize you don't actually want to do that. So then you have to figure out how to like squirm your way out of it. Like, oh, but that's not what I really meant because I don't want to do that anymore. There was this part in Wicked Saints that like came across as being like a prophecy. And by the time I started book 2, I was like, I don't like prophecies and I don't want to do this. How do I make it so it doesn't actually matter?
Well,
I figured it out.
You know, my approach is just to kill off the character that, you know, no, please, anybody that's watching, no, that is, yeah, get myself into trouble. But
if you get stuck, you kill someone or someone kisses someone else. It's one or the other. That's how you get through writing a series.
So I'm really curious, Emily, and Cinda also, because I know you're also a pantser. How do you know that you have a story? Like, at what point do you know that you're ready to start writing? Like, do you know who your main characters are? Do you know what your first scene is? Like, what do you know enough to be able to start on this journey of exploration?
I usually start with a character who wants something, and then and of course this character is flawed, and I start putting barriers in that character's way. So to me, that is the best way to start. From you don't have a story unless you have conflict. And so you start putting barriers in that character's way, and then other people, other characters arrive on scene to fill in. But unfortunately, I never feel like I really know the character until I've gotten through the first draft with them. And then there's a lot of fixing, like to try to make it look like I knew what I was doing all along. You know, okay, now I know who this character is, and so I'm going to go back through and I'm going to make things consistent, or I'm going to provide an arc. And probably one of the most challenging tasks I had, the 7 Realms, is a quartet. It's 4 books. And of course, I sold it as a trilogy. I'm gonna share my screen here and go to, those are the 4 books in the 7 Realms. And I sold it as a trilogy. And it was basically, I mean, the problem when you don't plan ahead is that when my agent said, "How many books is it?" I said, "Well, I don't know." And he said, "Well, I'd like to sell a 3-book deal." And I said, "Okay, it's 3 books." Yeah. And then I was writing the 3rd book in the series, and it was just mammoth, and everything was still a mess. And my editor kept saying, "Well, are you sure you can get this done in 3 books?" And so it ended up being 4 books, and the 4th book is, a real doorstop. So I don't really know how much time and distance it's going to take to finish. I would love to be a plotter. Are you a plotter, Intisar? Do you?
I am, but I actually had a very similar experience to you, where my companion novel to Thorn is coming out. Mm-hmm. And we sold it as 1 book, and I got 240,000 words on my draft and was like, there's still a chunk of story left. So
you go back and look at I remember when I started writing for young adult, it was back in the day when they said a young adult book should not be more than 100,000 words. And I was like, I can't tell my story in that space. But yeah, so your book turned into 2 books, right?
It did. So I mean, I'm following in your footsteps. Thank you for blazing the way.
Well, and the publishers may or may not be receptive to that. I'm writing a duology now, and I feel like I need more elbow room. And so I admire the standalone writer. One thing about one advantage of series, Emily, is that you come up with a set of characters, and world and you do all that work, and then you can just keep using that over 3 or 4 books. You don't have to come up with a whole new thing. So, yeah.
Well, I think that's one of the benefits of writing in a world where you're writing companion stories, right? So even if it's not directly a series, you're picking up different characters. You don't have to reinvent the world, quite literally. You can still play in the same sandbox with just different aspects of it.
Yeah,
I enjoy that.
And you can bring, you can take minor characters. I think that's what you did, didn't you, with the companion? You take characters, and the cool thing is that people that have read your first book will go, "Hey, I know that character. I remember." And so working with an ensemble of characters and that's kind of what I did with the Heir Chronicles, my first series. That's set in the magical world of Ohio. People aren't aware. People are not aware that Ohio is a magical place. And I wrote the first 3 books. Well, I'd written 2 books. I was so excited, and my publisher didn't want to take a chance on more than one. Well, let's just see how this works out. And fortunately, the Warrior Heir, which is the first book in that series, sold enough books that I was able to sell a second one, which was already written, called The Wizard Heir. But they still weren't willing to buy more than 1 book at a time. And then same thing, The Dragon Heir was the 3rd book. And then that one hit the Times list. And then all of a sudden, they're like, "Oh, we'd like to offer you a 3-book." Hence, I ended up with the trilogy that turned into the quartet. So I really, if you can plot ahead of time, I really recommend it. It just never worked for me.
It's like, I think Sharon said in the last set of speakers that, I start off with this beautiful plan and it never goes to plan. So I've actually learned, and grab one of my notebooks, planning notebooks, and show you, but so this is my planning notebook for The Theft of Sunlight, and it is completely 100% full. I start with just like, what are my character arcs? What's my setting? What does my character want? Like, what's the conflict? And then I will plot out like the first 5 chapters. And I know that if I go past that, it will be tossed because something will happen in those first 5 chapters that I did not plan. But my problem is that I can't get to the next set of chapters until I sit down and write in my journal and kind of figure out, well, what do I do with what's happening now? And so I'm like this, I don't know, like a plantser. Like, I have to plot a little bit, but I also have to pants a bit in order to get anywhere.
That sounds perfect.
That's every time because I'm working on something new, and I knew that it was going to be structurally difficult. So I was like, okay, we're gonna plan this one a little. And I found that anytime I tried to work ahead, like in an outline form, I would just like get bored and feel like, well, I've already written that, so I don't want to write it again and more. I did it already. And so I tossed that method about a quarter of the way into the draft, and now I'm at the point of the book that I call, well, we're just doing things now. I don't know where this is going, so we're just gonna do things.
That's awesome. Yeah, I can't.
Feels like it's time for a thing to happen.
Clearly you are in the presence of well-organized professionals who, have
exactly what
writing advice for all of you. A couple of questions that have come in, but I think maybe I'll ask each of you, all of us, what is the best writing advice you ever got?
That is a good question.
For me, is that you have to allow yourself to write badly in order to get enough on the page to work with. That you have to find a way to shut down the editor in your head. And I find the editor in my head sleeps late. So if I get up early in the morning while she's still asleep, I can have my way and there will be no interference. And then by the time she wakes up, I've got a number of pages that I can then go through and edit. Either of you?
I call that brain off drafting. I turn my brain off and then I draft. And that's how I can't, like, I also fugue state drafting. Like, I'm not thinking while I'm writing, I'm just writing. That tends to happen when I'm really close to deadlines and I start really panicking. But I feel like for me, the best writing advice I ever got was that all writing advice can be functionally useless to you. And so you have to be willing to try things, like try different tips that people give you and acknowledge that some things are not going to work for you at all and other things might. And so there's no like one size fits all for writing advice.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, those are really good points. For me, I think it was, and I can't remember who told me this, but they just said, be kind to yourself. And I didn't, it's the kind of thing that you're like, oh yeah, right. Okay, I'll be kind to myself. What does that even mean? Like, of course I'm kind to myself. What would I be, like, bullying you actually do bully yourself.
Yeah.
And even just this last week, I've really been struggling with writing. And I think one of the insights for myself has been to realize that although the previous 40 years of my life, I've done great with goals and deadlines, something happened in the pandemic. And if I have a goal or a deadline, I can no longer write. Yeah. And so literally what I have to do is be kind to myself and let myself goof off and not think about goals or deadlines, which is really hard to do when you have contracts.
Yeah.
But literally my work at this point is to rediscover my joy and give myself space and have fun. And I literally, I have to put that in my planner, have fun with my story today. Because I cannot hit these deadlines anymore. I can't do it. If I I did this little experiment where last week every morning I woke up and I lay in bed and the way I plot really before I'm able to write is I pull a blanket over my head and I'm in this dark space where there's no other stimulation and it's cozy, and I imagine where my story is going from here. And so I did that. And it didn't matter if I'd already done it for that scene and I just hadn't gotten to writing that scene or not. I did it every morning. Then I got up and I'd be all perky and excited. And I have young kids we're homeschooling. So it's not like I got up and could sit down at my computer. But whenever I got to my writing, I was like, I love this. And I was making amazing headway. And I was like, great, I'm doing great. Okay, so my goal for this month, and my productivity hit a wall the moment those thoughts came into my head and I had a goal. It was like, what is happening to me? And so I have to be kind to myself. I have to go, whatever is happening and how I'm handling stress. Yeah, I've got to be kind. I've got to be kind to myself and recognize that it will work out if I am gentle with myself. So yeah, that's my current advice.
That sounds very wise. I see one question that has come in, somebody that actually put their name on it. It's usually anonymous attendee. From Kaylin, do you stick to one genre or would you want to explore writing other genres?
That's a good one. I think that I'm really curious to hear what you both feel, but for me, I love speculative fiction generally. So I've written mostly in fantasy. I have a dystopia and I want to write. I probably have some sci-fi in me, but I always want something that is in some way magical, whether it's actual magic or technology. I want it.
Yes. We all understand. No
Yep.
intervention needed. That's why we're all here on the fantasy panel. Emily, other
I don't think I would like I have a sci-fi that I've been like poking at every so often for like 5 years. But I've never really felt like I've wanted to write outside of fantasy. I like writing in fantasy moral structure framework where terrible things can happen and that it's fine. It's whatever. It's just another day. It's still a lot of fun for me. And I don't want to have to think about like that and all of the real world implications of writing contemporary. Also, I don't want to ever have to deal with cell phones and like the passage of real time and like bands that people listen to. I don't have like any awareness of what teens listen to these days because I listen to metal, so it's like never been something that I've known. It would just be very stressful for me.
Yeah, keeping one thing, I mean, my first series was contemporary, and even in that, it took so long for my novel to find a publisher was that I had to change from a CD player to an MP3 player that my character had. And the only time I know that you have an interest in music, Emily, and the one time I really incorporated music into my books, the last two books in the Heir Chronicles, the Enchanter Heir and the Sorcerer Heir, it was about a magical blues guitarist. And the titles of all the chapters were murder ballads.
Yeah.
Murder ballads, but they're all these traditional, folk songs and blues songs about, she done him wrong, and, in the pines. So, and then I actually made a playlist of all these murder ballads, so, but in that way it didn't have to be contemporary music. So.
I have a question for you, Cinda. You're a very prolific writer, and for readers who are watching this who haven't read you before, when in your various chronicles or series would you recommend they start?
Well, it depends on what genre, what subgenre of fantasy you like. The Heir Chronicles are set in the magical world of Ohio. It's contemporary. I think it's more accessible to people that don't know that they're fantasy readers because, the first book starts out, it's all about soccer and a boy in high school whose girlfriend just broke up with them. And oh, by the way, he's a magical warrior being hunted by wizards and so on. The Seven Realms series, which begins with the Demon King, is long ago, far away. If you like magical thieves and princesses who kick butt, that's the series. And then I like to describe Shattered Realms as when things in the Seven Realms go from bad to worse, as if they could possibly get worse. And right now I'm working on Norse influenced fantasy, a project in that realm. So again, if you like high fantasy, I would start with the Seven Realms or the Shattered Realms. If you like magical Ohio, you could go to the Heir Chronicles.
Who doesn't like magical Ohio?
Well, I mean, a lot of people don't. I remember the first time I spoke to my editor when the Warrior Heir sold, they were all like, I mean, they're in New York. They don't even know where Ohio is. They're like, it's really interesting that you set your story in Ohio. You can just hear them saying, where is that exactly? Okay, I think we're running out of time and so much to talk about. And I really enjoyed getting to know you better. And just bear in mind, you can buy our books at the Buckeye Book Fair website, and they can be signed. So please take advantage.
Yes, please check. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining our fantasy novel and our young adult showcase this afternoon. And check out buckeyebookfair.org to order signed copies of our authors' books and check out our other events. Thank you very much, Cinda, for moderating this panel today. And it was fascinating. It sounds like we could talk all afternoon, but thank you very much for your time today.